trials go. It's been a relatively short trial. Madam Clerk, if I could have the monitors. Let's go over the testimony of the witnesses that you heard from the states today. First, you heard from James Santieri. He was a Springfield police officer. It was important. He had the body cam. He was one of the first officers on the scene, and he got there at about 12:23. And what his videotape showed was basically what was going on, and that how that scene appeared, the number of people, and that Dayvon Larry was getting treatment from a nurse that was a bartender, as I recall. And again, if I say anything that's different from your recollection of the testimony, use your own recollection. And there was also a Army paramedic that was providing first treatment to Dayvon Larry. And then you see Brandon Polkowski. He had the hat on. He was a paramedic from Beach Fire. He arrived on the scene at about 12:26. And what was significant about his testimony was he came up and he pretty much checked Dayvon Larry's eyes. I think he said he borrowed a flashlight to check his pupils, and there was no response. And he ultimately testified that Dayvon Larry quit breathing, and his heart stopped, and that there was CPR, and you saw that being administered. Next, we heard from Kylie Stewart. She was the birthday girl. She is Zach Kaiser's wife now. She told you that she is a nurse, and that they had all gathered on this Easter Sunday on April the 9th to celebrate her 21st birthday. She was legal. She could drink. And she indicated that she had been dating Zach Kaiser, who's in the military, at Tyndall, and that that she had been dating him about a year, and that she got to know his friends, Dayvon Larry, Austin Wallace, Ryan Drummond. They all kind of worked together, and I think she indicated, when you're in the military, it's kind of like your family, because everybody's families are other places. And she said that Zach Kaiser, Ryan Drummond, Austin Wallace, Dayvon Larry, and Chris Bustillis all decided to go to Applebee's. They went to Applebee's and had dinner, and they went to a pool hall, and then they went out to Coyote Ugly. And I don't recall if she indicated the time they got there, but you ultimately heard the time they arrived from Investigator Pelletier. They got there about 10 till 11. And again, keep in mind on any of the videotapes that the hour is in military time, and it's also all the security cameras inside Coyote Ugly's is off an hour. So it was an hour behind. So she got there, and their group got there about 10 till 11. And she, initially saw a fight that occurred inside. You've seen the videotape. I believe her testimony was that, she saw Dayvon Larry, and I think her testimony was that she didn't see him hitting anybody, and that he was restraining Malcolm Santiago, who was a member of their group that showed up at about 11:15. She said primarily she was focused on Zach Kaiser. She did not want him getting involved, and I think she indicated to the security guards, is what her testimony was, that John Chester was a problem, and he was escorted out, and you saw everybody escorted out, and she and Zach stayed inside, and she did not see anything that occurred outside at the start of the fight. She just knows that she went outside and she saw her friend Dayvon Larry laying on his right side, and she said she recognized his tennis shoes. He had been talking about the new shoes that he had bought earlier. She is a nurse, and she went up, and I think she indicated she tried to administer aid. Then you heard from Andrew Pelletier, and he was the investigator in this case. gave you an idea of the scope of this investigation. And I forget the numbers, but I think there were 20 hours of security video and 17 hours of body cam, 300 photographs taken, 15 witnesses interviewed. It was a large investigation. He indicated the first thing he did as he came onto the scene was he diverted to the Holiday Inn. And basically they had gotten information, hey, they were looking for Ross Johnson and John Chester, and they had got information that they were staying there. And he went in, went to the room, and no answer, and then he verified with the security video that they hadn't been there. Investigator Pelletier came back to the scene, and there he did his job as the case agent. He explained he was kind of the one in control, and people were getting interviewed. And ultimately he said that he found Toby Wallace and Tim Helton, and they were taken to the police station. And those, as you recall, Toby Wallace and Tim Helton were part of the group with the defendant and John Chester that had came down from Illinois and went on to Panama City to kind of enjoy a day down here. And he interviewed them at 3:17, and then he reviewed the security video from Coyote Ugly. He had the statements of Toby Wallace, and ultimately the defendant, police located him. They called his number. They went there, and the defendant was brought down to the police station, and he was interviewed for a lengthy period of time, about 5 hours, and he explained why. Basically, they're putting all this case together. It just happened at 12:20, 12:11 that morning, and this is now 8 hours later, and he's reviewed some of the security. He's gotten briefs on what the witnesses say, and he sat down with the defendant, he and Lieutenant Anderson. And what was important was he told you about what he had learned as investigating defendants. You don't always get the truth the first time out of the blocks. Very rarely does it happen. And that you have to basically chip away at it. I think he indicated that during his time with the defendant that he caught him in about 10 or 11 lies. And whether that it was that important or not, the issue was that the defendant was not being candid with Investigator Pelletier. He ultimately, the defendant initially said he went out the front door. I think some of the other things he testified about, he said that he bumped Mr. Larry. He could have pushed him, and then ultimately he was kind of wishy-washy about, well, I could have hit him in the face with my right hand. And I think that was the upshot of it. He was also not candid about going back to the Holiday Inn. He indicated that he went to the Holiday Inn and changed clothes, and ultimately that changed. And he talked to him about his MMA training, and that's you will learn when you hear the definitions on justifiable force that you take into the capabilities of the people involved. The fact that the defendant is a trained MMA fighter that fought for 3 years and practiced 2 or 3 times a week is an important issue in this case. In fact, he's had seven fights. Investigator Pelletier also told you another important detail. The distance where Dayvon Larry was laying on his right side, how far he was from the fight that ensued between Santiago and Chester, that second fight. I think his testimony was 35 to 40 feet away. That's a critical piece of testimony. Then we heard from Malaya Ream, and she's a college girl. She came down with her friend, Ms. Haverson. They were at Coyote Ugly. She met the defendant. They were having a nice time. She went out on the patio. You see her going out on the patio. And, she said the defendant came out and said, I need to go help my friends, jumped over the railing and took off. But when he went over the railings, she saw him hit somebody that was by themselves in the head, and she was very clear about it. And I asked her, how sure are you? And she said 100%. That was her testimony. She saw the defendant hit this person by himself, which we know is now Dayvon Larry. She testified her and Ms. Haverson quickly got an Uber, and they went back to the Casa Loma where they were staying. She said she provided a Snapchat address, and that ultimately the defendant, she invited the defendant over, and the defendant and John Chester showed up, and she told you that I think 7 or 8 out of 10, the defendant was drunk. And she said they went to sleep shortly thereafter. She got up to take a shower. When she came out, John Chester and the defendant were getting dressed to go down and meet the beach police, and his words to her were, I'm going to jail. I think she also testified that prior to going to bed, that the defendant said, well, we're not going to the police tonight, I'm too drunk. And that he did not seek out going to the police. It's important to note that the defendant didn't hang around the scene very long. Toby Wallace and Timothy Helton did, but the defendant was there a short period of time. I asked him, I think he said he wasn't sure, about 15 minutes, but we know that he left. I would submit to you that he was there long enough to know that Dayvon Larry was seriously injured. And then we heard from Toby Wallace. Toby Wallace, a friend of the defendant, he had met him, known him for 5 or 6 months, use your own recollection, but they met at work, but they were good enough friends that they all traveled together here. Toby Wallace was heavily involved in both the fight inside and the fight outside, and you saw it for yourself. You saw him throwing blows inside the bar, and then you saw him in that cell phone video of what I'm going to call the beatdown of Santiago. He was right in there, and ultimately he got hit towards the end by a fellow that came up at the last, Austin. But he indicated that what they had done that day, and as he and Timothy Helton were standing there, I asked him if the defendant said anything to him after the police had came and had settled everything down, and he said, well, yeah. He said the defendant came up and said, I hit that guy and I think I killed him. The defendant knew. He knew he had hit him with his best punch, and that Dayvon Larry was not good, that he was seriously hurt. Toby Wallace told you he went down and was interviewed, and then ultimately he told you one other important piece of information. That a couple of weeks before this, the defendant had told him, said, yeah, my dad told me to always hit somebody open-handed if I was outside the ring, never hit them with my closed fist. Well, what's important about that? Well, that's important. The defendant knew he had a punch that could hurt somebody, and he admitted it. I asked him, and he said on cross-examination, I asked him, you can cause great harm with a punch, with your punch, and he said yes. And then we heard from Dr. Radke, our medical examiner, and Dr. Radke, you heard his experience, and you saw the photographs. You saw the fracture behind Dayvon Larry's left ear. He testified. I said, is this consistent? The damage on this, is this consistent with a punch to the head? And he said, yes. Blunt force trauma. And I asked him, I said, was the defendant was a punch to the back of the head the cause of death? He said yes. And then there was talk about, it was right here by this part of the brain, and he described something called koku, or use your own recollection, but basically where the brain of Dayvon Larry moves forward. And there was some injury on the inside, but the last 3 photographs you shown, I said, was that from anything of Dayvon Larry falling to his right side? And he said no. There was no indication of any abrasions on the right side. And in fact, you saw that photograph where the scalp was pulled back, and he indicated there's no damage there. It indicates. So that was from the punch, the defendant's punch. Basically knocked Dayvon Larry's brain loose, and it went forward. And we know Dayvon Larry was in bad straits because we go back to the paramedic that was there and said, I want to get any response out of his pupils. He quit breathing and his heart quit breathing, or quit beating. Then you heard from the defendant, and you heard his testimony. One of the things that you will be told in weighing somebody's credibility as a witness, does somebody have an interest in the way this case is decided? Well, do you think the defendant who's on trial for manslaughter has an interest in this case? Absolutely. But he did testify to his training, and I asked him about the MMA fighting. I said, hey, isn't that a foul to hit somebody in the back of the head? And he finally admitted, yeah, it is, that they're not allowed to hit people in the back of the head. And I asked him why. He was well aware of hitting somebody in the back of the head, that that's dangerous. It can likely cause serious bodily injury or death. And he admitted that his punch caused great harm. He knew exactly what he was doing. He came up and he looped around and he sucker punched Dayvon Larry.
Objection, Judge. Facts not evidence.
He sucker punched Dayvon Larry. He didn't confront him. And I asked him, I said, there were a lot of things you could have done. You could have tackled him. You could have done everything. You could have pushed him. You could have put him in an arm bar. He chose to throw that punch that you see that arm going up to the left. I anticipate the judge is going to give you something like this for the instruction of manslaughter. We've talked about it. As to count 1, the state has to prove 2 elements. Dayvon Larry's dead. That's not an issue in this case. Ross Allen Johnson intentionally committed an act or acts that caused the death of Dayvon Larry. Based on the testimony you've heard today, I submit that's not a real issue. I'll skip down to convict of manslaughter. It's not necessary for the state to prove that the defendant had an intent. He didn't have to intend, but we have to prove that the defendant intended to kill Dayvon Larry, just that his act was reckless, was negligent, something more than negligence. The defendant is charged with a separate crime of aggravated battery. And again, it's got 2 elements, and that the state has to prove, number 1, that the defendant actually intentionally touched or struck Dayvon Larry against his will or intentionally caused bodily harm to him. And 2, in committing the battery, intentionally knowingly caused great bodily harm to Dayvon Larry. I submit the state has proven both of those. Now, you're going to hear a lot of justifiable use of non-deadly force, which means that the defendant did not only use non-deadly force to stop Dayvon Larry from using an unlawful force. And then you're going to hear also an instruction about deadly force. You're going to hear them a lot, but I think the parts that you need to pay attention to and to look closely at Ross Johnson was justified in using non-deadly force against Dayvon Larry and had no duty to retreat if he necessarily believed that such conduct was necessary to defend another against Dayvon Larry's imminent use of unlawful force. Well, we know Dayvon Larry was 35 to 40 feet. You saw the videos of Dayvon Larry, and the defendant admitted that he saw Dayvon Larry basically holding John Chester with a beer bottle in that first fight sequence. Nowhere do you, in that video, and none of the witnesses saw Dayvon Larry ever strike anybody or ever hit anybody with that beer bottle. In fact, it appeared to me he was trying to stop the spill it. But his action, I would submit, was a defensive action. And you saw him as he went on. What he did, Dayvon Larry did in that video, that first video about the fight, was he went over and started trying to restrain Malcolm Santiago, the person who had gotten in the fight. He was not attacking the defendant, his group. He was a peacemaker. He was trying to settle things down. So, I will submit to you, there's no reasonable belief that Dayvon Larry was a threat to anybody. He had the opportunity inside the bar. And again, in deciding whether Ross Allen Johnson was justified in the use of non-deadly force, you must consider the circumstances at the time the force was used, the danger not being actual. However, to justify the use of non-deadly force, the appearance of imminent danger must have been so real that the defendant actually believed the use of non-deadly force was necessary. Moreover, a reasonably cautious and prudent person under the circumstances would have believed the use of non-deadly force was necessary. And at the bottom, it says, in considering the issues of self-defense of others, you take into the account the relative physical abilities and capabilities of Ross Allen Johnson and Dayvon Larry. And again, we know all about Ross Johnson being an MMA fighter for 3 years and having wrestling prior to that. You're also going to get a very similar instruction, except it's when it's talking about the use of deadly force. I would submit that's what Ross Johnson did. He knew his hands could cause great harm. And I would submit a punch to the back of the head is using deadly force. And in that particular thing, Ross Johnson was justified in using deadly force if he reasonably believed that such force was necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to another, which would be John Chester. And I would submit there's no evidence of that. There's no evidence that Dayvon Larry was threatening John Chester in any way. The only thing you see with John Chester is Larry keeping him at arm's length and letting him go. And again, the same in considering the self-defense of another, you take into account their physical capabilities. This is a still shot, and you'll be able to see it. And the timing of this becomes very important. Again, the clock's back by an hour, so it would have been 12:11:02. And you see John Chester walking out the bar. So the rest of this sequence is in 28 seconds. And that's John Chester walking out. There's Santiago and Drummond. There's Toby Wallace, and there's Dayvon Larry. Notice he puts the bottle down at 28 after. He goes a full 2 seconds, and then you see the defendant coming up from the left. This is a still photograph at 12:11:29. You clearly see the bottle on the ground, and you see at the top. You see at the top of the screen where the defendant is and where Dayvon Larry is. I would submit that he is behind him and approaching him. $12:29. I would submit that clearly shows the defendant behind Dayvon Larry, and if you look close, and you'll have these photographs back there with you so you can look at them for yourself, you see that left arm. The defendant hit Dayvon Larry behind the left ear. The medical evidence supports it. That's what Malia Ream supports. He's a trained fighter. He knew his punches caused great harm, and he knew from his MMA that hit somebody in the back of the head was not good. Dr. Radke told you that blow to the back of his head is what killed Dayvon Larry. That happened 35 to 40 feet from where Chester and Santiago were fighting. Remember the defendant's testimony when I asked him, I said, well, how was he a threat? And remember his answer. I'll have another opportunity to talk with you at the end. Thank you.